History does not name the vanquished, it simply erases them from the very pages they helped to write. The story of the Beaumont family, one of Boston's wealthiest and most respected merchant families in 1773, is no exception. It cannot be found in the chronicles of revolutionary heroes, but exists only in yellowed letters and the silent haunting of a key that would never again turn in its lock. Samuel Beaumont was a man of order. He believed in the law, in the stability of the British crown, and in the sacred bond that had brought prosperity to the colonies. To him, the self-proclaimed Sons of Liberty were not patriots, but a hysterical mob, smugglers trying to wrap themselves in the cloak of idealism to conceal their greed. He would often sit in his warm, mahogany-paneled study, sipping a glass of Porto, and explain to his 17-year-old son, Thomas, that their prosperity and that of the entire city was built on the foundation of trade and the protection of the empire. "Loyalty is not a choice, Thomas," he would say, his voice deep and certain. "It is the bedrock of a civilized society. Without it, we are merely a pack of wolves tearing each other apart." But outside the sturdy walls of the Beaumont estate, the air was changing. There were the whispers in the taverns, the pamphlets pressed hastily into hands on the street, the gazes that grew colder each day upon his family. His wife Eleanor felt it most keenly. She cared little for the Stamp Act or the Navigation Acts, but she felt the shift in a neighbor's smile, the awkward silence when she entered a shop, and the sound of street children yelling "Tories" as the family carriage passed. She tried to speak to her husband, but Samuel merely dismissed her fears. "They are merely radicals, my love. The storm will pass." But the storm did not pass. It grew. That December night in 1773, the night history calls the Boston Tea Party, was the beginning of their end. Samuel stood at his second-floor window, staring out at the harbor, hazy under the moonlight, and for the first time in his life he felt a chilling dread. He did not see heroes fighting for freedom. He saw masked faces, heard savage cries, and watched as chests of tea, the very symbol of commerce and order, were splintered and thrown into the black water. To him, it was not an act of protest, it was an act of barbaric vandalism. The next morning, the silence that fell over the city was more terrifying than the shouting. Samuel arrived at his office to find an effigy, dressed in his own clothes, tarred and feathered and hanging from a tree. At its feet was a sign, "The price of a traitor." That night, Thomas came home with a bruise on his cheek. He had argued with his old friends, the boys he had grown up with, played with, who now called his father an enemy of the people. "You don't understand, father," he shouted, defying him for the first time. "They are not a mob. They believe in what they are doing. They believe in a different future." "A future?" Samuel scoffed, but his laugh was bitter. "A future without law, without order? A future decided by angry men in the streets?" That argument cut a chasm through their family, a crack that mirrored the division of a nation.
History would later record the Siege of Boston in 1775 as a glorious feat for General Washington and the Continental Army, a testament to the unyielding spirit of the Patriots. But for the thousands of Loyalists trapped inside the city with the British Army, it was 9 months of hell. The Beaumont family, like so many others, had seen the British military presence as a shield, a promise that order would soon be restored. But they were wrong. When the revolutionary cannons began to roar from Dorchester Heights, that shield became a cage. Food grew scarce. Firewood became a luxury. Diseases like smallpox and dysentery swept through the crowded streets. Samuel was forced to sell his family's precious silver just to trade for a few sacks of moldy flour and some salted meat. Their magnificent home grew cold and empty, the laughter long silenced, replaced by the whistle of the wind through the window panes and a simmering fear. Meanwhile, outside the city, their estate was seized. The Massachusetts Provincial Congress passed an act declaring all property of absentees and enemies of American liberty to be forfeited to the revolutionary government. Samuel's farms, his warehouses, his ships, everything he had spent his life building was confiscated. The chronicles of the victors would call it a necessary act to fund a just war, a righteous punishment for those who chose the wrong side. But to Samuel, reading the news on a tattered paper in a freezing room, it was an act of plunder, legalized by the mob. His faith in the law, in justice itself, was shattered. He hadn't just lost his fortune, he had lost the very foundation upon which his world was built. His son, Thomas, was living in a different kind of hell. Suspected by the British for his old friendships in the Patriot ranks and seen by those same friends as the son of a traitor, he belonged nowhere. He walked the streets of Boston like a phantom between two worlds, bearing the weight of a conflict he did not create. Some nights he would climb to the roof and gaze toward the campfires of the Continental Army, wondering if there was another truth out there, another path he could have chosen. But it was too late. His family's name had been branded Tory, a verdict from which there was no appeal. In March of 1776, the final decision came. The British Army would evacuate Boston. For the revolutionaries, it was the day of liberation. For the Beaumonts and 1,000 other Loyalists, it was the day of exile. They had hours to gather what was left of their lives. Eleanor walked through each room, her hand gliding over familiar furniture, over the portraits of ancestors. Every object held a memory, a piece of their family's soul. They could not take it all. They could only choose the smallest, most precious things. Eleanor chose her mother's jewelry box. Catherine, the little daughter, clutched her rag doll. And Samuel, in an act of both desperation and defiance, pulled the heavy brass key of the main door from its lock and slipped it into his coat pocket. It was a useless object, but to him it was the last proof that this house had once been theirs. The scene at the wharf was a chaos of fear and despair. Wealthy families huddled next to poor artisans, all united by a single crime, loyalty to the king. They crowded onto cramped transport ships, not knowing where they were going, only that they could not stay. As the ship slowly pulled away from the dock, Eleanor could not bear to look back, but Samuel did. He stood on the deck, braving the bitter wind, and watched the city's silhouette shrink. He saw the roof of his own house, the place where he was born, where his children were raised, now just part of a foreign skyline, a world that was forever closed to him. He clenched the key in his pocket. It was cold, just like their future. They were drifting toward Halifax, Nova Scotia, a cold British land, with the hope of a new beginning. But deep down, Samuel knew they were not settlers seeking a new home. They were refugees, people who had lost their own homeland. Halifax was not the promised land. It was a raw, unforgiving port town, overwhelmed by the tide of refugees and utterly unprepared to welcome them. The British government's promises of compensation and aid were just hollow words. The Beaumont family, once pillars of Boston society, now lived in a cramped, damp, rented house on what little savings they had left. Their former wealth and status meant nothing here. To the native British, they were merely Americans, an inconvenience from a failed war. Samuel, a man who had once commanded a trade empire, now struggled to find even menial work. His pride was eroded, chipped away with each passing day. He grew silent and withdrawn, spending hours by the window, staring at the gray harbor, his hand absent-mindedly fingering the old key. It had begun to rust. Eleanor, with an extraordinary resilience, tried to hold the family together. She mended their old clothes, cooked meager meals, and told Catherine stories of a beautiful Boston, a world that now seemed like a fairy tale. But she could not heal the wound in her husband's soul, nor the confusion in her son's eyes. Thomas tried to fit in, finding work on the fishing boats, but he always felt like an outsider. He was not Canadian, and he was no longer American. He was a product of the divide, an uprooted tree, unable to take root in any soil. In 1783, the final news arrived. The Treaty of Paris had been signed. America was officially independent. To the world, it was the birth of a new nation. To the Beaumont family, it was a death sentence for their hope. The door home was now slammed shut and locked forever. They had gambled on the losing side, and now they had to pay the price. Official history would stop here. The records in Massachusetts state that Samuel Beaumont's property was auctioned off for the public good. His name appears only on the lists of Loyalists who fled. The story, from the victor's perspective, had a tidy ending. But the story of pain never ends. It continues in the silence. It lives in Samuel's sleepless nights, in Eleanor's quiet tears, and in the aimless life of Thomas. A few years later, on a cold winter night, Samuel Beaumont died of pneumonia, but his family knew he had died long ago, on the day he left Boston. He was buried in an unmarked grave in Halifax. As Eleanor sorted through her husband's few belongings, she found the key. It was almost entirely rusted over, but its shape was unchanged. She kept it, not as a memento, but as a reminder of a world that was lost. Their story, and those of tens of thousands of other Loyalists, was buried beneath the grand speeches of liberty and republic. They were the unacknowledged victims of a revolution. They were not wicked traitors, but simply people who believed in a different world, a different order. They had been caught between the great millstones of history and crushed. Decades later, a historian researching migration to Canada
would stumble upon a short entry in the diary of a woman named Catherine. She wrote of her father and the key to a house that no longer existed. There were no other details. Where is that key now? Was it thrown away, buried with her father, or is it still passed down, a silent relic of a forgotten tragedy? History is written by the victors, but perhaps the truth is not found in the words carved in stone, but in the silence of torn-out pages, in the echoes of forgotten names, and in the cold touch of a rusting brass key that will never again find its lock. The story of the Beaumont family is a quiet reminder that history is never a simple tale of heroes and villains. It's a complex tapestry of personal conviction, heartbreak, and loss on all sides. We are taught to celebrate the Patriots, but what about the thousands who believed they were defending order and civilization? What truly defines the line between a patriot and a traitor? Is it conviction, or is it simply which side wins the war? I would be honored to read your reflections in the comments below. And if you believe that the most profound truths of history are often found in the stories that were never told, please subscribe and join us on our journey into the shadows of the past. Thank you for watching.